Okay, this is the Decision Games version of the old SPI 30 Years War Quad. I haven't set it up yet. I'm going to be playing White Mountain first, go through them in historical order. It's a little different from the SPI quad. They added a battle. I don't remember which one was the new one. I didn't bother looking that up. It quite possibly is White Mountain, which is kind of an interesting one to do. I did a long time ago Breitenfeld, which was the fifth wheel of the original SPI quads. In this case, it's going to be pretty much the same system, but I am going to go through the rules because I only sort of went through them in the Breitenfeld game. I kind of glossed over that. I was less intent on giving a rules explanation of the games. And I figure I'll give one here since that's become sort of my standard style. So what you've got here, and I skimmed over these briefly, and I'm mainly going to work through them with you, as I like to do. I don't think a lot of people are, dying to find out about this game, although a few are. It had more thumbs than I expected on the request list. All right, well, let's start looking. So first of all, you have your troops, which are going to have two values, a combat strength and a movement allowance. And on the back side of those guys, they have their disrupted value. Now there's a cav charge capable square in there. I'm not used to that from Breitenfeld. We'll see what that works out to mean. You got artillery pieces, which in Breitenfeld at least were fixed units, and I think they will be here too, where they're just kind of placed on the map and get to fire, and if you get in their way, well, then you can't fire them anymore. In this one you have supply wagons, which have some new rules for them. And then you have your leaders, who have a combination, again, movement allowance and a leadership value, which is also their combat value, essentially, if they're mixed with units. Okay. If I'm correct, yeah, so they used the same, these must be the old ones. White Mountain must be the new one, because you can see here they have all the units spelled out on the map, and that's what they had in all the old ones. I don't know what the setup for White Mountain is going to be. I haven't started doing that, but you can see they've used a different format for the graphics of it. For better or worse, I don't know. Personally, I like the old graphics on Breitenfeld better than the graphics that I'm seeing on these maps. And I certainly don't know with the counters. I'm okay either way, I guess. There's something I like about the old SPI counters. That's, kind of for no good reason. The colors and the they had like a black on solid color components. It was one of the first games that I'm used to. Well, things like what is it? Your Panzer leader and stuff like that had men on them, and squad leader had men on them. But for what's essentially an operational style game, this has just, figures of men instead of NATO symbols. I don't like NATO symbols on my old style stuff. Okay. So the sequence of play is pretty simple. You have a disruption removal phase where you get to roll dice to see if your unit's undisrupt. Then you're allowed to fire your artillery, following however the artillery fire rules work. And if I recall correctly, that's mainly to disrupt the enemy units rather than cause any casualties, so that your approach and your attack are more effective. Then you're allowed to move. Now, unless something's changed, zones of control are fluid in this game. Movement's going to be by your movement allowance. You've got terrain effects chart on here that's all pretty simple. We'll talk about those as we get there. And then you're allowed to attack. In fact, attacking is largely mandatory. However, disrupted units don't have zones of control and aren't forced to attack things. But otherwise, it's pretty much your standard war game of this era, where you must attack everything you're adjacent to, and everything you're adjacent to must be attacked. And there are some specifics to make that work out correctly. You can do soak-offs and such in this. Okay, for artillery, you have to draw a line of sight. If you can't draw a line between hexes without hitting an intervening hex that has either a hill or something that'll interfere with you, or an enemy or another unit, enemy or friendly. I wonder which way I said that. So if you don't have any blocking terrain, you can fire. And then when you fire, you'll be firing on this artillery fire table. And your goal is to get a disruption effect. And as you can see, the further away you are, the harder it is to get an effective shot. Disruption doesn't sound like a lot, and the artillery in this era was not terribly effective. It was better for breaking up the formation so you can hit it better, which is why it's represented in that way. Of course, it does real damage in things like the musket and pike series, where you have to actually worry about it. And it would at closer range, certainly. Artillery is, I believe, unmovable. And so if the enemy walks up to it, they can capture it. We'll see if anything's different about that than I think it is. And if artillery is captured, I believe you can, yes, you can turn it around and fire it on the enemy, which is perhaps a little weird. It happened at times and not at others. Musket and pike more or less ignores that. Here, it's just part of the game. You're allowed to turn your artillery on the opponent. Movement is pretty standard. You pay movement point costs according to the terrain effects chart. Anything exciting there? Well, there are things like Cav cannot enter the woods in Nordlingen. Towns are pretty much immovable. I'm not sure what the terrain in here is. We have forts and things, which there's going to be special rules for the scenario based on that, because that's new stuff. And I don't know what battle they dropped out. Rivers are impassable, but this looks like it's only a stream, which is just going to add some movement point costs. You may never walk through your own units. This is a major change from the original edition of the rules, because the formations were fairly large and dense, so they couldn't really maneuver through each other in the same way. I'm not sure how true that is. Not that the formations are dense, but that at this scale there wouldn't be gaps that were sufficient for some units to go through each other. So I'm a little iffy about that, because the scale of the game is, well, 175 meters, and strength points are only about 100 men each, 45-minute turns. So yeah, let's see. Friendly and enemy zones of control have no effect on movement, however, which is to say that the distances are considered great enough that you can't lock an enemy unit into combat. That's a little weird, but a 45-minute turn may be enough time that a unit could break out of combat and move a little differently. I think it's a pretty significant abstraction on the whole thing, and a little weird. Okay. Now, zones of control are going to enforce combat on you, and they also cause some issues with leaders applying their bonuses. They can't cross an empty zone of control to do so. Combat itself is pretty simple. You're going to come up with a simple odds ratio. Now, like I said, there are some weirdnesses that this is shared with a lot of war games, which is to say, because all units must attack all adjacent units must be attacked, and all units must attack if they're adjacent to units. So basically what happens is you assign your units that are in a position. Let's see if we can, I can't open this up. You're going to assign units, and this is, I've done this in the Napoleon's Art of War thing. You're going to assign your units to attack. So, for example, if I was attacking here to here, or if I had these two units next to each other, I might have to attack here. If I'm facing both of these, I have to attack both of them. But if I have kind of a more complex situation, that's a leader, then things get more complicated, right? So I could figure out, okay, I want 15 against this 6, and I'll do this here. So then I have a 2-to-1 and a 1-to-1, and I pre-allocate all those, at least in my head, to make sure that every unit I have attacks some adjacent unit, and every adjacent unit to my units is attacked. And, well, that's about that. Let's look at the soak-off rules here. Terrain, of course, can have an effect on combat, and we'll worry about that within the chart. So you're allowed to make attacks on poor odds in order to do a diversionary or soak-off attack. So, for example, I could decide, well, that 1-to-1 is almost a diversionary attack, and in fact, if you look at the combat chart, there may be some disadvantage to doing a 1-to-1 attack. Defender disordered, defender eliminated? No. Disruption exchange. So both sides are going to be disordered on this, and just the attacker's disordered on that. Well, 1-to-1 looks pretty fair. If I had something like this instead, not that. Geez, I don't know. I could make like a 1-to-2 attack here, so I can get a 4-to-1 on this unit, right? And that's allowable. And I think I'm allowed to go to the below the bottom of the stack. There doesn't seem to be a limit on how strong an attack I have to make for a diversionary attack. Any unit attacking is sufficient to do so. So I could be down on what, the 1-to-5 table or whatever, or worse, and pretty much ensure that my unit's going to be either eliminated or disrupted, but that'll allow me to get better odds attacks that I consider more important. Okay, so the special thing here is disruption. When disruptions happen, you flip a counter over, and that gives a new combat strength. They have a movement allowance that's not in movement points anymore. It's 2 hexes that are no longer, that are not prohibited for it. The other effect of disruption, well, that becomes their new combat strength. They have no zone of control and they're unable to attack, and do not force attacks anymore. They're so beaten up that they no longer project that zone of control that forces the enemy to attack them. And during the disruption removal phase, you roll a die, and on a 5 or a 6, they're undisrupted, but there's some modifiers to that. One of those modifiers is leaders. Okay, if a leader is stacked with a unit in combat, it can add its strength to that unit. If it's within 1 hex of a disrupted unit that is not adjacent to an enemy unit, well, disrupted units can't undisrupt if they're adjacent to the enemy. If the leader is within 1 hex or stacked with, then it adds its leadership value to the disruption recovery roll. So, for example, in this case, I'd only need a 4 or higher to succeed. A leader can only add its strength to the unit it's stacked with, obviously, but it can actually help undisrupt as many units as it likes. Sometimes armies will become demoralized. I think that'll be handled in the specific rules for the game, how many hits they have to take to become demoralized. If they are, then they're going to have a general effect that disrupted infantry can no longer recover from their losses. Disrupted cavalry only recover on a 6. And the movement allowance of all disrupted units becomes only 4 hexes per turn. There might be additional rules for the scenario. Now, there's an optional rule for command control, and I do not remember this being in the original. I think they added this, but I'll play with it. Units are in command if they're in radius of their friendly leader. The radius is going to be the leadership value of the leader. So this guy has a radius of only 1, but a chain of adjacent units can all be in command together. So you want to keep your units together. And that sounds vaguely familiar. So maybe it was in the original. If it was, it wasn't an optional rule. Well, I'll look that up before we start in terms of that, just for the historical perspective of the game. They also added a looting rule, which has to do with the wagons. If you're within a couple hexes of one of those supply wagons, well, you count as being out of command. Well, what does it mean to be out of command? Good question. It means that your movement allowance will be halved, and that seems to be the only effect of it. That's the rules to the game. It's really that simple. We're going to have exclusive rules for each of the scenarios. There's 4 scenarios. It's a quadra game after all, so 4 battles. And I'll come back after I've set that up, and then we can see what that's like.